Okay, welcome everybody. I believe it's time to start. Welcome to our first open research event, which we've called a launch event. And I'd like to welcome you as our audience. I'd like to welcome particularly our external speaker, Rachel Bruce, who's head of open research at UKRI, and our panelists. Before we get started, I wanted to say just a couple of words as to why we're having this event now and how we're going to run the event. So back in around October time, our University Research Committee established an open research strategy group and an open research operations group, founded on the belief that, to quote a phrase that we're familiar with now, that research should be as open as possible and as closed as necessary, and that we should do something to coordinate the activities at York, and in particular to build a community of practice. And holding this event is to mark the fact that we've now published on our website our statement about open research and our first steps towards building a community of practice based on activity that's going on across campus and about which you're going to hear a little bit this afternoon. So in a moment, I'm going to hand over to our PVC for Research, Matthias Root, and then we'll have our invited speaker, Rachel Bruce from UKRI. Then we've 3 lightning talks from our 3 faculties, 3 people called Emma. I'm not quite sure how that happened, but 3 people called Emma. And after Rachel's talk and after the 3 lightning talks, there will be a Q&A. Now, you can access the Q&A, I believe now, and you feel free to put questions in there at any point. And those are going to be collected for me so that I can pick out some of those questions to ask the speakers after their talks. We're then going to conclude with a little bit of an open discussion about what we do next. And at that point, you will be able to use the raise your hands function if you want to speak, but we're also opening a Slack channel for you, which you can, which will be made accessible to you. And we want to capture as many of your thoughts as possible so that the Open Research Strategy Group can understand what you think about this, what we should do next, and that will help feed into to what we do. Okay, so I think that explains what we're going to be doing this afternoon. And so I'm going to introduce you now to our PVC for Research, Professor Matthias Root, who's relatively new to the university, come here from the University of Alberta. And I'll hand over to you now, Matthias, to say a few words, please.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and welcome everyone. Good afternoon. I'm really delighted that you can all join us as we showcase the work of our open research community. This clearly is a unique opportunity for us to start a conversation about the future of open research at York, and I'm looking forward to being part of this and seeing you contribute to this as well. As you know, the University of York is committed to the values and principles of open research and the long-term development of an open research culture. The core idea behind all of this is that open research has aspects that support and are supported by the entire research cycle and should be accessible to all people possible. And as Sarah already identified, one of our mantras here is that open research means that it's research that's as open as possible and as closed as necessary. It really embeds many of the values that the university embraces, values of inclusivity, diversity, integrity, and accessibility of the research process. It's based on the belief that knowledge produces the greatest benefit when it exists in a commons, and that research produced through public funding should belong to and exist for the benefits of us all. As a university, our aim is to actively create and pursue opportunities to grow and foster a value-driven, pluralistic, multifaceted approach towards an open research community and open research more generally, that we embrace disciplinary differences and that we support our staff and students in the process. So it's in that vein that we will be hearing today from researchers from different disciplines, from different backgrounds in education, psychology, and biology, who all have engaged in and are advocates for open research practices and principles. But before we get there, I'm now very delighted to welcome Rachel Bruce to this forum. She is the UKRI Head of Open Research and serves as our keynote speaker. Rachel is currently seconded to UKRI from JISC, where she was the Director for Open Science and Research Lifecycle. She's now leading a review of UKRI policy for open access publications. And as part of this, she's directly involved in Plan S, the International Research Funder Collaboration on Open Access. And with that, I want to hand it over to you, Rachel.
Thank you for asking me to join you today at this University of York event, although it's in strange circumstances. I had University of York in my diary, and you know, I was thinking people might be thinking, gosh, she's off to the university, but here we are on another Zoom. So I've been asked to speak about open research covering challenges and key developments. And of course, there are many different ways in which you might slice that. I'm focusing much more on UKRI and our current priorities. But hopefully with that, that will give some of the broader policy context to the Open Research Initiative and the talks that I'm looking forward to hearing later. Sorry, somehow my slides aren't moving and I'm not sure why. There. Okay, so UK Research and Innovation. I should just remind everybody of our scope. It includes all of the research councils in the UK, also Research England, Innovate UK, and we work with the government to invest around £7 billion a year into research and innovation. And our overarching goal is to create knowledge with impact. And of course, to do that through partnering with research performing organisations and different stakeholders in academia and industry. Just to place open research in our objectives. So we have some key foundations to provide the knowledge environment, and those are talent and skills, working internationally and global collaboration, and also infrastructure. And then we have the trusted and diverse system, and that's where primarily our open research activity sits, but of course is relevant to all of those other key foundations. So in the UK strategy, we work on programmes obviously of investment, but also change and leadership around those issues across the research base. In terms of I suppose the developments around open research, I think that whilst we've had in the UK a direction of travel in this area for a number of years, I always see it as something that's been largely driven by the possibilities of technology. And of course, there's been open access principles, there's been data management policy, and that's been part and parcel of practice within the UK for a number of years. But there were two key things that happened in 2012. And one of them was the outcome of Janet Finch's review of open access that reported into government. And so the UK government made a commitment in 2012 that UK's research that is funded by the taxpayer should be open. And there was a preference for immediate openness. And of course, in this aspect, we're talking about research papers. But in parallel, the Royal Society also published their Science as an Open Enterprise report. And that really articulated the opportunity to take advantage of data, but also the necessity to make sure that data that underpin the scholarly record should be available and should be shared. And really, I mean, it was a report that was recognised around the world as well, and I think it had quite a lot of influence, and pointed to the fact that we should take advantage of technology, skills and data and the need for transparency and good research to create an open science revolution. I won't go through these benefits, but of course, you know, open research is around increasing impact, but also supporting good research and research integrity. And via that, there are loads of other benefits too. In terms of the definition, I just thought I would comment really on the University of York Open Research Statement. So on the left of my screen, I've got a definition of open research or open science, which talks very much about that technology and data-driven drive for a new form of research and collaboration. But underneath that has the idea about things being able to be reused and accessible. But I think that this definition comes from, probably about 4 or 5 years ago. And I do think that things have developed since. And there's now a more common recognition that when we talk about open research, it is, as the University of York statement says, about the whole research life cycle, and thinking about how research can be open and more collaborative at all different stages. And that mantra, as has already been said, so research being as open as possible and as closed as necessary. I know that early on in some of the work around open research, often a huge barrier was the fact that people confused the fact that IP might be given away or sensitive information. So that phrase has actually been incredibly helpful, you know, as open as possible, but closed where necessary. And I think also making sure that the research process is transparent and of course that efficiency element. So overall, I think the York statement really sums up and is the definition for open research that I would concur with. And I think actually some of the focuses around international policy also show that. So of course, open research or science is something that is worked on globally. All of the G7 nations recognise it as an important direction for research to achieve economic and social impact. And they have initially focused on open science around, it was data initially. They've had exchanges around policy and directions of travel on open access, but their last statement on open research, which was back in 2017 under the Italian presidency, recognised this need to develop and support incentives for open research, and that was an element that really needed to be addressed in order to change and embrace the benefits of open science. And they also pointed to the need for federated infrastructure globally to support the what's obviously now commonly known, the FAIR principles of data, so findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable. That G7 Open Science Working Group is still in existence. I am a member of it. We are still focusing on those two key aspects from the 2017 statement. And just to note that the UK takes over the presidency next, and of course with the huge changes that we are all experiencing, I'm not quite sure what the agenda will focus on, but of course COVID will shape that greatly, and I'm hopeful that open research will still have a place. In terms of UKRI's current priorities, and the scope, of course, of open research, as we've said, is really broad. But the activities that we have been focused on, the main one is the UKRI Open Access Review. And this is quite challenging, as I will go on to mention. The goal is to determine a single open access policy across all of UKRI bodies. So that includes Innovate UK and Research England. Obviously, previously we had a Research Council's shared policy. And that will cover research articles, but also this time we've included for the first time monographs, book chapters and edited collections. The second priority within our strategic prospectus is to focus on open research data, and there is work around that, in particular around the provision of infrastructure to support fair data, and included in that is the recognition of data stewards and research technicians, and the importance of rewarding those roles and seeing them as part of a research environment to support open research and good research. And then also we have an activity around, research culture and responsible research evaluation. And there's quite a lot of focus on that across a number of different areas, but it's in the open research team that we're leading on the strategy for that across UKRI. I just wanted to mention a recent report that was published on the 6th of June, and it was in response to a request from the House of Commons Science and Technology Committee. So when they undertook their review into research integrity, they made a recommendation that the cultural aspects around research integrity should be examined. And UKRI commissioned VTI and the UK Research Integrity Office, working with the UK Reproducibility Network, to undertake research to explore this issue. And so it gives us some insights into some of the cultural issues around research integrity. Overall, it seems that researchers are really driven personally and have a personal desire to undertake work with integrity, of course, and that's a common motivation. But there are a high percentage that say they can be tempted to compromise, and that's really about the research environment that they're in, and where it might be that shortcuts or there's pressure on them in terms of the way in which they should undertake their research. What was interesting in terms of the open research aspect is that both open access and open research data were identified as two of the top 5 positive incentives to drive research integrity. And the other 3, I should say, were interdisciplinary research, training and development, and also research leadership and management. So those were the positive elements, and then again related to the open research agenda, some of the negative drivers around research integrity was the inappropriate use of metrics such as the journal impact factor, also referencing things like university league tables, etc. And it was interesting though that only that 75% of the respondents hadn't heard of DORA, the Declaration on Research Assessment. So one of the things around training and development here was that was obviously seen as something that was positive and could drive research integrity, but also if you dip deeper into the report, it shows that the level of support for training within open access and open research and data management is not at a level that researchers would welcome and require. And in fact, that does seem to be, it aligns with findings that are emerging from our open access review. So obviously open access quite often, I think, gets into a very contentious space because it becomes quite complex and people don't have the support or sometimes the understanding of particular issues such as licensing, for instance. So that seems to support the findings of the open access review as well. But overall, the research integrity report talks about, creating an environment that values and recognises and rewards, as well as research integrity, of course, as part of that open research. So in a way, that's what I think you are embarking on at York. And so in terms of that being one of the key recommendations or ways forward, it looks as if you're on that path. And then I just wanted, again, to reflect on some of these challenges in terms of meeting open research requirements. There's so many positives and benefits assumed around open research, and yet sometimes attaining and moving to achieve open research is fairly challenging. So we've got all of these policy statements, good political will. Here, going back into 2002, the Budapest Open Access Initiative. There's also, it appeared very radical at the time, because the European Council actually called for immediate open access by 2020, and they put that goal out there to try and push and accelerate change, and yet change still was slow. So here, just as a illustration, on the right hand side is some chart from Coalition S. So all of the funders that are working for the Plan S Open Access Initiative that work as part of Coalition S, they've undertaken analysis of the Scopus database to show where research outputs from the funders involved are in terms of open access. And you can see around 27% are open access and the rest are non-OA. So given all of that will and all of those statements, that shows us that making that change is quite challenging. And then on the left-hand side, in the UK, obviously, we've had the the monitoring of the open access policies, largely coordinated through Universities UK. And they've been looking at it from a multi-stakeholder perspective. Back in 2017, their final report was published, and it showed that within the UK, we had 37% of UK authored articles were immediately open access. And whilst that was world leading at the time, I do know that lots of other countries are making great strides at the moment. So I have to say at the time, because it may well not be a leading figure now. It was also far short of the target that we had set ourselves following the Finch review, which was that Research Councils UK put in place a target of 75% immediate open access, and so it fell some way short of that. So that just brings me on to the open access review, which is the main focus of our activities currently. And as I said earlier, there is the inclusion of monographs, but this framework here is really set out from the perspective of research articles. And given that in some ways that seems to be the most challenging aspect within the review because of all of the different interests. So the review overall has the shared goal of really meeting immediate open access. And as you've heard throughout that policy context, that is now a goal generally held by public funders and governments. And at the same time to have a policy that maximises reuse, but also a really important issue is this value for money and affordability, because costs have been escalating in order to achieve both open access and also access to subscription content. We also have the goal of sustaining the quality, and that's actually the quality of peer review. I have to say that that hasn't been such a huge feature in the review, but was felt to be something that we just needed to keep a check on. Another very important aim was, of course, ease of compliance, so making it easy to implement our policy and to adhere to it. So overall, those were the goals that we're trying to achieve through this open access review, but as well as working across UKRI bodies, we are also working with the devolved nations, and so looking to align as closely as possible with the Research Excellence Framework, but that is the REF after REF 2021, so some way off. So there's some elements of change that we can consider. Of course, what might be the routes to open access, repositories, journals, platforms, what are the licensing conditions around the research outputs, and then also how do we make it happen in terms of funding and is funding still required? I would say it appears that it is, because UKRI gives a special grant for open access, and all of the evidence shows that something like that should continue. But there's still a question about the amount, duration, terms and conditions, and the real purpose in terms of that funding for it to be most effective. And then a big issue is, of course, when does the policy take effect? Because there is this whole element of change and moving stakeholders along, you need to get the timing right so that the policy is feasible, but also meets the ambition that we have set ourselves. So underpinning all of those aspects, we've also been looking at issues around infrastructure that might need to be supported, also rewards and sanctions, and working with stakeholders nationally, but also globally. And mainly the global collaboration has been through Plan S. But I should make clear that whilst our policy and immediate open access is a shared goal, some of the ways in which our policy may end up may vary from some of the Plan S aspects, but I think that overarching goal is strongly shared. The open access policy has been out for consultation. The consultation has closed and we're now analysing those responses. Just in short to say, so the position that we put out to consultation is that research articles accepted for publication on or after the 1st of January 2022 should be open access immediately. And there are two routes really. So one is via the journal or publishing platform immediately. And the other is via a journal or publishing platform that allows you to make your author accepted manuscript immediately available under a CC BY license in a repository. And with monographs, we're talking about introducing that at a later date, 2024. Similarly, multiple routes to achieve the goal, but we have suggested a 12-month embargo period. And of course, this is far more immature than research articles, so there's quite a lot of open questions in the consultation. There's a huge array of different considerations in the review. So a wide variety, as I've said, of stakeholder opinions, so research performing organisations, publishers and researchers, and within that, a huge diversity of views. We have tried as far as possible to listen to all of those views and are considering how best to put in a policy that as I said, meets our ambition, but also respects the research environment. So I would say all stakeholders have agreed on the goal of open access, it's just how to get there. And then there are some real points of detail that people vary on. So for example, licensing is one of those. We're also trying to consider where there might be positive or negative impacts on research culture and whether or not, as a result, the policy needs to have some form of supporting action. So for example, we will be taking undertaking an equality, diversity and inclusion assessment. And we've also consulted quite broadly on those questions in terms of issues that we might want to take into account. Throughout the review and all of the stakeholder engagement, we've heard that those cultural issues are really important. So we will be taking those into account, as I say. But then, of course, with the pandemic, we now, as we all do, have to take into account what does that mean in terms of how will that affect the research and innovation system, and also our priorities around open access. So it'd be really interesting actually to see, because we extended the consultation deadline because of the pandemic, and it will be really interesting to see what sector and different stakeholders have said about that issue. Again, just to give a bit of a sense in terms of some of the breadth of work within the review, we've also been working with the Department of Health and Social Care and DFID to examine open access and potential impacts in lower and middle income countries. Of course, we do support research in lower and middle income countries, mainly through collaborations. And the idea of this piece of work is to try and understand, again, whether or not there are support mechanisms that we should put in place. It's quite interesting seeing that, you know, you can quite easily say, oh, well, there's waivers, but actually the operation of those and also cultural issues around using a waiver exist. So this is another piece of work that we have undertaken in ASP, were commissioned to do it. And it's being finalised at the moment. We had a large set of external reviewers which have input to it. It's more likely there'll be some aspects that will be taken forward within our open access policy, but it's more likely that there's longer term interventions, and we're seeking to work in international partnership with other funders on those issues too. My slides aren't moving, sorry. Right. I've mentioned culture a lot and incentives, recognition and reward. And again, throughout the review, we've heard time and time again about the importance of DORA or similar, and that addressing issues around research promotion and review are intrinsic to change within publishing behaviours. We already at UKRI are a signatory of DORA, and of course many universities are. We have implemented across the Research Excellence Framework with the other devolved nations practices around responsible research assessment, and also within UKRI we have now with our panels, but there is more that we could do. And again, we'll be taking that into account in the review, but it is a far broader issue than simply the open access policy. So with all of those challenges that we are navigating and taking into consideration, of course, something which is slightly, I suppose, double-edged in lots of ways is the COVID pandemic. And in some senses, it shows how open research can help meet some of the challenges and the impacts and help find solutions to global challenges, research questions. And at the same time, of course, is hugely, hugely challenging for all of us in many different ways. What we have done alongside a number of other stakeholders is committed to the Wellcome Trust statement around open data, and the research that UKRI is supporting on COVID, which is either repurposing of existing grants or our new open rapid research calls. We seek all of the findings to be made available via preprint servers, for open access to the journal final submitted papers, and also, of course, for data to be made available as openly as possible. And alongside that, we've also added in our terms and conditions, it doesn't come so strongly in the shared statement, around software and modelling codes as well, to be shared as openly as possible. So with all of those challenges, the challenge of COVID has, of course, brought about a demonstration of how researchers and also publishers and other stakeholders can work collaboratively and openly to address issues that we all face. And finally, I just wanted to mention again the Research Integrity Report. And I think that the environment question and making sure that the environment that funders, that publishers and institutions and researchers partner in and cultivate is obviously incredibly important in terms of maintaining open research and achieving open research. And indeed, the activities at York seem to be pointing in that direction. So thank you very much.
So thank you, Rachel. This is the moment at which we're all clapping, which of course we can't quite do. Thank you for your talk. Just before we go into quick Q&As, I just need to offer an apology to some of our attendees, and I gather that there was some difficulty on Zoom authentication for some people getting in. So we started out with about 60 or so participants. We fixed the authentication thing, we're now up to 80 something. So apologies to those who missed the beginning, but it is being recorded and you'll be able to see the recording and catch up on the bits that you missed. However, you didn't miss the chance to ask questions, which is what we're going to do now. And we've got a couple here, so I'm going to read out the questions that are appearing for you, Rachel. So the first one comes from Julian Richards, who is the director of our Archaeology Data Service. And he asks, as you noted, world-leading open research is seen as needing international e-infrastructures, where most of the investments come from the EU, e.g. EOSC. How will UKRI help maintain UK leadership in these infrastructures post-Brexit?
Thank you very much, Julian. Yeah, a challenge. I think some of the infrastructures that are developed may have started from some of those investments, but for example, Elixir and others, the situation with Europe doesn't affect the UK's participation, but where we have, as you're mentioning, European Open Science Cloud and developments in that area, we obviously do need to work out what our position is. And it's part and parcel of the negotiations that are underway. I should say that in particular with the European Open Science Cloud, I was the member state representative on the governance board, and of course I can no longer attend the governance board because of our status, but we do have a lot of UK participation in those discussions, and in fact UKRI via STFC are part and parcel of the Secretariat for the European Open Science Cloud. So we are able to monitor closely and we are keeping engaged with different stakeholders and working with BEIS in terms of what the response should be. I can't say anything more specific than that, but obviously it's part and parcel of negotiations.
Thank you. And I think we've time for just one more question. We haven't got much time, but I would like to ask it. It's an interesting one from an anonymous attendee, which says, what can the University of York accelerate to position itself as a leader in opening up its research outputs for scientific, social, human and societal benefit? Where should we focus our energy for the next 2 to 3 years?
Oh, well, that's an easy question, isn't it? So I think that the idea of cross-disciplinary activity and working is probably an area to take seriously. I note that, like you said at the beginning, you have different disciplines and respecting that disciplinary diversity, of course. But it's amazing as well how different disciplines can learn from each other in terms of their practices, I think. So also offering that opportunity across the university so that skills are promulgated and so that, you know, York remains a desirable destination for world-leading research. I think, you know, supporting skills and cross-disciplinary collaboration is extremely important.
That's very much at the heart of our research strategy, the cross-disciplinary work. Okay, I think, thank you very much, Rachel. I think you get to sit back and watch some talks now. So thank you. And we're going to move on now to our 3 lightning talks, and I'm going to introduce all 3 of them at once just to help the smoothness of the process. So we've 3 speakers who are all called Emma, but all from different departments and all sort of different career stages. We have Professor Emma Marsden from Education, whose talk is Open Research Practices in the Language Sciences, Materials, Data and Findings. We have a postdoctoral research assistant from Psychology, Emma James, who's going to talk about Open Research Means Open Conversation. And then we have a lecturer from Biology, Emma Rand, whose title is A Software Sustainability Institute Fellowship, Targeting PhD Students for the Transmission of Open and Reproducible Practice. So 3 lightning talks, and please use the Q&A to put your questions in. I'm going to ask them all at the end after our 3 speakers have spoken to us. So over to you, Emma.
Well, I'm really happy to be able to contribute to this important event today. Open research practices have been at the heart of much of my work over the last 15 years. So given a taxonomy, we've heard about how rich and complicated open research is. Given a taxonomy like this, where should we possibly begin? So I'm going to focus on open materials, open data, and open findings and publications, but along the way also touch upon reproducible research, open science evaluation and open science policies in 10 minutes. So first of all, I'm going to talk about why open research practices are needed in my field of interest, the language sciences, and then I'm going to give some examples of initiatives that I've been involved in. So we've heard already various rationales for the importance of open research, the philosophical and social rationales. Epistemic responsibility relates to a sort of a sense of intrinsic duty that we feel towards sharing the knowledge, both methodological, data, findings, sharing the knowledge that we gain, and that duty sort of imposes a moral and ethical imperatives upon us to share that knowledge. There's also the economic rationales that we can be more efficient by working together, pragmatic rationales, and the arguments related to social equity. However, I'm going to talk about the scientific benefits of open research practices because these are arguably less subjective and go right to the very heart of researchers' aims to produce high quality research. So examples from my own field about why we need open materials and data. So these examples are designed to shock a little bit. So where are we? How much are our materials available? By materials, I mean instruments, things we use to collect our data, the most obvious being, say, a questionnaire or a language test. So far we have about 17% of our materials that are available in the second language learning sciences. 4% of a kind of test called a self-paced reading, and about 35% of judgment tests, with little improvement over time. Now, why does this matter? Well, we all know that reviewers ask and editors ask for more information. How are the data coded? How many items were in this test? And one particular weakness in our area is that we're quite poor at reporting reliability. The reliability of our measures was only reported in, well, 3% or 16% in these different kinds of research that you can see here. So we're not very good at reporting reliability. Research reports have weaknesses, they have limitations. Another reason why open research practices are important is it can help reduce the extent to which we're tempted to engage in what's called questionable research practices, ranging from actually making up data to perhaps trying not trying to publish something when the findings weren't statistically significant or how we would like them to have been. And in our field, a survey found that 86% of researchers ranging from PhD right up to professors said that at some time or other they had engaged in a questionable research practice. This has been done in different fields as well. We're not alone. And so one way that we can validate our research to find whether these questionable research practices are having an impact on our findings is to carry out replication research, and yet we don't. We found that overall the proportion of replication studies in our area is about 1 in 400 studies. Well, what's this got to do with open science? And if more materials were available, clearly replication would be a lot easier. So how do researchers replicate when, as I've just said, our materials are not openly available? Well, researchers have to recreate the materials. Obviously, that means that they're not exactly replicating the study, or they have to work with the original authors. So let's have a look at what happens when researchers join up with the authors of a previous study and carry out a replication. Well, when there's no author overlap, when you replicate a study that's been done by somebody else, you tend to find that your findings are generally supportive of the earlier study. Now look what happens when there's author overlap, when you have to turn to the original author in order to get hold of those materials. There's a massively exaggerated difference there between whether your findings support the original study or not. And if I haven't convinced you already, a final reason I'll mention is the very poor availability of data. So this impedes our ability to compare data sets. For example, in that synthesis of replication research in our field, we found that only 6% of replications actually examined the previous data set and combined it with their new data set for a new analysis. And synthesis and meta-analysts ask authors for their data sets, and there's a very poor response rate. Only about 1 in 6 authors actually provide their data sets for all sorts of reasons. Okay, so I hope to have convinced you. I've given 5 reasons why open research should be helpful. And I'll now go on to give some examples of open research practices I've been involved in to try and address some of these concerns. So the first one I'm going to talk about is called IRIS. IRIS first received funding 8 years ago from the ESRC to establish a repository of materials that have been used for research into language learning, research into teaching, language use and policy, anything related to language learning really. IRIS now has got long-term funding from the British Academy and in-kind support over the last 8 years from the University of York's Digital Library team. All the materials have been used for accepted, peer-reviewed publications or approved PhD. So this is not for work in progress. This is materials that have been peer-reviewed, or the research has been peer-reviewed. And all the materials comply with open science principles of being free, reusable and adaptable. You can see here there are huge numbers of people involved. So the ontologies were developed from 2011, and this process is still ongoing. And IRIS is highly searchable with terms for the categories of research, methods, data types, participant types in our field. And it's an ongoing mission to control these ontologies. People uploading their materials obviously like to add new terms, and we have to stop this mushrooming out of control. So we approve some new terms as the field develops, new terms come on board, but we decline duplicates, paraphrases and anomalies. So now we have over 5,000 files uploaded on IRIS across a wide range of topics, languages. We've had 44,000 downloads. The database is highly searchable, as I've mentioned, and here are some other key statistics about the scope of IRIS. We now hold data. We've got a good number of data sets. So how's IRIS going? Oh, sorry. So I wanted to just show you a snapshot of the search interface where you see you can search for the key terms and then refine your search using the filters on the left. And then when you click on a file, you can, on one of these findings or one of these results, you see a lot more information about that instrument, and then you can click on download and access the instrument itself. So how's it going? At 8 years old, you can see slightly, if that exists, slightly exponential uploads on the left there, and downloads gradually increasing as well. And of course, these two are connected. The more you use open science, the more you feel the need to contribute to open science. And where are the materials coming from? Well, 37 journals suggest to their authors that they make these materials available. And some editors go a step further. They award badges to they insert an open science badge on the author's work, and this sends a strong message that the research is open for scrutiny and replication. So 3 journals in our field currently do this, offering the open materials and open data badge, and the 3rd journal also offers a pre-registered badge as well. I can talk more about pre-registration in Q&A if anyone's interested. It's seen as being an important pillar or way towards more open science practices, and at Language Learning we introduced registered reports in 2018. At this point, I think it's worth mentioning that, as Rachel alluded to, there might be a new era of benchmarking arriving. So, for example, the first Transparency and Openness Awards by the Centre for Open Science were made earlier this year, which acknowledges the efforts of journals to support open practices. And as of 2020, the journal citation reports are running a trial to include data about how much each journal publishes open access. Okay, there's also, if those carrots aren't enough, there's also likely to be a citation advantage for having materials on IRIS. So in language learning, for example, articles that were published in 2013, about 20% of the citations of those articles can be explained by having materials on IRIS. There is a way to go though. We did a big trawl of thousands of articles, and of those articles that are eligible to make their materials open access, actually only 13.6% of articles are making their materials open access. So there's a way to go. Now, what about access to findings? I appreciate I've got about one minute left. What about access to findings? We've found that in our field, about 1 in 10 articles are freely available, as in open access or made freely available by the publisher. And when we did a survey, only about 2 in 3 teachers and 1 in 3 teacher educators, 2 in 3 teachers and 1 in 3 teacher educators said that they had never read an academic article. So clearly our research is not getting through to the practitioners who give us their data and who fund our research. And there are various different reasons for this, including the fact that they say they can't access, they can't understand the research, they don't have time and they don't have funds. We found as well that professional publications are not citing academic journals either. Just about 12% of references in professional publications cite our specialist academic journals. So there's clearly a gap here. So with a team of researchers funded by an ESRC IAA grant and a small British Academy grant, and now the Department for Education, we established OASIS. And this has created an infrastructure and a sustainable mass of summaries of peer-reviewed research into language learning, education and use. So the summaries adhere to guidelines that we agreed with a team of 15 senior journal editors in 2018. And you can see the structure of the accessible summaries here. Each one is just 1 page long. Our downloads are increasing, now on 6,300. And we've now got 486 summaries online, and this is sustainable because it's journal driven, which is the unique aspect of this initiative. There are many summarizing, synthesizing kind of initiatives that spring up, but none to our knowledge are journal driven. So various journals really support our ask their authors. Some actually require authors to write a summary and others strongly encourage them. So this is my second to final slide. Perhaps open research needs to be driven by these kind of top-down initiatives from our institutions or from journals. But is there support from researchers themselves? So we asked applied linguists in our field, how beneficial to the field do you think openly available research materials or data are? And you can see here that the overwhelming response is yes. We see that it is very beneficial. Open science is very beneficial to our research. So why aren't we moving faster? So I leave you with a provocative quotation here, and that in many instances, open science appears to be somewhat like the proverbial electric car, an indeed sensible thing, which would do better to be parked in the neighbour's garage. An idea everybody agrees upon, but urges others to take the first step for. So I hope that the university's commitment to supporting open research can help us to prove this perception wrong. Thank you for listening. I'm now going to hand over to Emma James from the Department of Psychology who I know runs a fantastic group to promote our understanding of open research practices.
So yes, I'm Emma James. I'm a research fellow in the psychology department. And to me, open research means being able to have an open conversation about the whole research process. And that means both having those conversations within our research groups, but also in disseminating our work. So what do I mean by an open conversation? Well, I mean an interactive situation in which any person can freely communicate without any kind of fear or concern. And in having open conversations, we're better able to learn from one another, and we're left feeling energized and inspired. And I think these kind of features of an open conversation are really central to what open research is. So I'm going to start by talking today a little bit about why that's not always necessarily been the case in psychology and the kinds of steps that we're taking to improve that. And then I'm going to move on to talking about the Reproducibility Journal Club initiative that creates space for having these conversations in our kind of local research communities. So why does research need to be open, and why does it need to be an open conversation? Well, obviously we need to be able to communicate every aspect of that research process so that we can learn from one another and we can kind of build momentum in that research field. So why has it ever been closed? Well, that's a very big topic. That would be more than this 10-minute talk. But just as a snapshot of some of the issues in psychology, I gather they're quite similar in other fields, but there may be some differences. We know that it's hard to publish null or conflicting results, which means that if you've done some very thorough research, but your data hasn't been quite as clear as you'd expect, it can be quite hard to get it out there. And we know that publications are important. And so I'll also mention these questionable research practices. It's been estimated to be up to 78% in our field. And as Emma mentioned, it's not necessarily that we're all hugely fraudulent scientists, but that perhaps we underestimate the consequences of certain statistical practices, or maybe not reporting everything quite as fully as we should. So that's problematic when we're trying to learn from one another. So the reported methods just aren't detailed enough. And unsurprisingly, that leads to a pretty low estimated replication rate for psychology. So rather than feeling energized and inspired, we're left with these conflicting incentives of good scientific practice, but needing that publication to get your next job, to get your next grant. And I should say that whilst these statistics kind of paint a pretty bleak picture of psychology, I mean, these are studies in themselves. They have their own limitations and constraints, but it's clear that we have a kind of cycle that we need to try and break out of. So how are we doing that? So I'm speaking from my perspective as an experimental psychologist. So I typically design experiments to look at word learning. I might teach children and adults new words and see what affects how well they remember them. So within the context of my PhD research, open research practices went right back to the planning stages. So Emma mentioned pre-registration already. We're encouraged to try and kind of pre-register a protocol for our experiments online before collecting the data. So this will be exactly what our research questions are, how we're going to go about testing them, what our statistical plan is. And that means that later on down the line, you can't kind of tweak your questions to pretend you were testing for anything else, and it stops you from over-analyzing your data. I would then also try to make my materials available. So that might be just the given words that I was teaching in a particular experiment, or the tasks that I used to train and to test my participants. And I would also try and prioritize using open source software so that when I shared my materials online, it didn't require someone to have an expensive software license to be able to access them. Once I'd run my experiment, I would then share my data online. I usually do this all via the Open Science Framework. And I also then learned to use open source statistical software to analyze it. So R is a scripting language, which means that I can show people exactly how I've gone from the data to the results that I'm presenting in my thesis or in my paper. And finally, of course, then we can talk about open access to the end product as well. And recently I've taken to using a SciArchive, a preprint server, to be able to share openly available access to my manuscripts. So this isn't to say that during my PhD I was doing all of these things perfectly, but that I was constantly trying to build on and improve the reproducibility of my work. And I think this was important because it made space for having conversations about research practices in my supervision meetings, which otherwise I think kind of get lost amongst all the other things that there are to talk about. So I think making space for these conversations about research practices is really important. So by having an open conversation about research practice, we can discuss the challenges of different practices. So, you know, good science is hard, and sometimes it can be really helpful to acknowledge that. And we can learn from one another and be motivated to try new things. So I think we're more likely to try a new practice if we can see that our colleagues have engaged in it, they've lived to tell the tale, and we know that we can ask them questions if we get stuck. So just last year, we launched a reproducibility journal club that provides a space for talking about these kinds of issues. So I can't take any kind of credit for reproducibility itself. So this was originally a journal club launched in 2018 by 3 early career researchers in Oxford. And essentially, a lot of other early career researchers thought it was a good idea, and the initiative took off. So it's now supported by the UK Reproducibility Network. And on last checking, there are 92 different journal clubs spread across 25 different countries. So this is really great because it means that we have our own local research communities for discussing ideas and sharing the challenges of open research. But also it means we're part of this bigger network as well. So the organisers can all communicate with each other via Slack. And just a couple of weeks ago, hosted the first big international meeting as well, online, of course, in the end. So we launched just over a year ago in summer 2019. This is Anna Gutterson, who's a PhD student in the department, and I have to say she was really the driving force behind us getting started. And since then, we've been meeting fortnightly during term time. It's really informal. We have a mix of people attending, ranging right from research assistants to lecturers. And in each session, we have a paper, and someone volunteers to chair the discussion. So this might be a paper that's evaluating a certain practice, evaluating the state of science. It could be an opinion piece, but they also kind of serve as a platform for sharing our own experience and discussing the broader issues as well. And it's all just designed to be very informal. We used to be able to provide refreshments, although of course now we meet virtually via Zoom. So why is this important? Well, I've come to value the kinds of conversations we have in reproducibility for kind of 2 main reasons. First, I think it provides a space for talking about research methods and approaches in a way that we didn't really talk about them before. So I think it used to be that you'd learn kind of approaches to data management and planning from your PhD supervisor primarily, and these were just kind of implicitly passed down your academic family tree. But I think creating a space for having these conversations just means that you can learn from more people, which is a really good thing. And I think it's also fair to say that, you know, a lot of these open practices are new, and in which case PIs and supervisors might not always be best positioned to be passing on those practices. They might not yet have the hands-on experience themselves. So this means that a collaborative approach can be really helpful in driving change. Second, I've heard multiple people comment that reproducibility can be a little bit like therapy, and that might sound a bit daft, but actually I think the pressures of open science can be quite real, especially for early career researchers, because we can see that this is the way research is headed. We can see that from funding bodies, but the paths in that direction aren't that clear yet. So I think just creating a space where we can talk about the challenges can help to alleviate some of those anxieties. Okay, so I think that being able to have an open and upfront conversation about research is really at the very heart of what open research is. We need to be able to communicate that whole research process without any concern. But I think that it's really helpful to be creating these spaces to have those open conversations in our local research communities as well. And that helps to overcome some of the barriers. And of course, Anna and myself would be very happy to share our experiences with you if you're considering something similar. And thank you very much for listening. That's me done. And I will now hand over to Emma Rand in biology, who's going to be talking about the Software Sustainability Institute Fellowship. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much for that, Emma. I found that a really interesting talk, and I really liked your focus on the benefits of working openly, because I think that's more or less what my talk's going to focus on as well. So thanks for the invitation here today, Ben. I will share my Software Sustainability Institute Fellowship project with you, not least because I'd quite like other people who are listening here today to apply and encourage them to do so. So what I'm going to do, whoops, let me just make sure I've got my screen on. What I'm going to do is just outline my role in the department and my route into taking an interest in open science. What I've kind of identified as a step towards the widespread adoption of open science practices, and how this led me to applying for a Software Sustainability Institute Fellowship. And I'll briefly introduce what the SSI is and their mission. So my undergraduate degree was in biology, and having done a bit of wrestling with ridiculously uncooperative and unpredictable living organisms in field or laboratory research, I started to get what I thought of as a very sensible interest in mathematical models of biological processes and data analysis, which I saw as rather more controllable. So this led me to a postgraduate degree in biological computation at York. And following that, I was employed to teach statistics and programming to other postgraduates. And at the time, I thought that was going to be a very short-lived career path, because it was like 20 years ago now. And I thought, well, sooner or later, all biologists are going to be able to do these kind of data skills fluently. But reader, they did not. And the skill sets moved on too, so I am still here. So now I'm a teaching and scholarship lecturer in the Department of Biology, and I teach reproducible data analysis, version control, package development to undergraduates and postgraduates in my department, and a bit more widely than that. So the people I teach are not always incredibly enthusiastic about this. So when I asked first year stage 1 students if they're going to enjoy doing data analysis, this is what they say. So 70% of them disagree that they're going to actually enjoy it. And whilst this isn't quite true of our postgraduates and staff, there's something I find in common with most biologists, which is that they don't really want to learn to code. They just want to be good at research. So this led me to focus much more on what the benefits of working reproducibly are for doing good and efficient research. Oops. So this is the picture that Emma put up as well. I have no idea she was going to be sharing it too, Emma Marsden. So there are quite a few routes to and definitions for open science, but my routine has very much been associated with the reproducibility angle of it, which I think came over in the other 2 talks we had too. So this sort of interest in reproducible research was partly for my own benefit because I want to be more efficient myself, but also in the interactions I had with particularly early career researchers, and I had a real strong desire to see them working a little bit more efficiently, because they come to me with what I might think of as a spreadsheet of horror, in which they've got data organised in various places in tables all across a spreadsheet, not necessarily organised as well as these two. And it's really difficult to track where the numbers come from, where the results come from, and how everything links together. And it's rarely actually written down in any way at all. So I also found that PIs were contacting me with a sort of confused look on their face, trying to work out how a student's data set had led to a particular figure in a paper, which they now had to edit slightly in response to reviewers' comments. So I think open research is reproducible research, and that makes it faster because people can reproduce what they've done before and respond to comments much more quickly. So it makes better science, I think, as Emma James was saying earlier. So these observations got me thinking about how to tackle this from the bottom up. So we talked at the beginning of this session, Rachel talked about the sort of top-down processes involved in creating carrots to do this kind of work. And really I focused on how we make it more beneficial for the people at the bottom of the career. So my fellowship was based on this idea that when you have a lab, you have the PIs in a lab or research group, and they're constantly working hard to drive their lab forward in terms of techniques and methods, particularly for data generation in biology. And the way to make those sustainable is that the people who develop those methods will write down protocols or adapt protocols and they live in the lab, and the people who then come into the lab later on can then implement those same data generation methods. So now we have quite a lot of PhD students who are getting this training in data analysis and reproducibility and coding and things during either their undergraduate degree or their postgraduate training. And that means they're able to implement programming solutions or reproducible programming solutions to scientific problems. However, when they move on, you often find that their solutions or their data analytical methods haven't remained in the lab, which kind of limits the forward practice a little bit. And the main reason for this is because although they get trained in a lot of data analysis methods, they don't get trained at all in the skills to, or little, to document, disseminate and share code and work collaboratively on code. So this is exactly what we need for those data analysis skills to end up being sustained in that lab for the people that are coming in future. So my fellowship project was focused around developing these dissemination and reproducibility skills in PhD students in order that you can actually properly infect laboratories with this kind of sustainable practice. So the Software Sustainability Institute, it's, if you've not heard of it, it's a UKRI funded organisation, and they have a mission to promote the idea that good software practices create better software and a greater amount of reproducibility and reusability in research. So they call for all researchers to have access to training in this kind of sustainable open practice, and also for software to be recognised as a valid research output. So some people talked earlier on about creating better reward systems for working in this kind of way, and they campaign for research software engineers, for example, to have proper recognition for their input into research. So the fellowship program provides an individual with at least £3,000 to increase their own sustainable practice or improve their own sustainable practice or that of others. And it actually applies to all disciplines. So I come from the sciences, and our other two speakers were from psychology and education, but it also applies to all disciplines. So even in ones where you might not expect to normally get research software engineers, like we do in science departments quite often. So you get this free grant, and they also give you money to go to full expenses to attend workshops and conferences to help you build collaborations with other people in the institute. And I've actually found one of the best benefits of this community is the sense of community you get from interacting with other people who are interested in open and sustainable science, or research, I should say, across the country. So I'd like to encourage you to apply. It's a fantastic application system where you have to produce a video saying why they should give the money to you. And it's been a really positive experience. So if anybody wants to ask me questions about that, I'm happy to answer them. So with that, thank you very much.
So thank you, Emma. And I wonder if all three Emmas could switch their videos on. because then we'll try to take some questions for you. And we have one question which was initially addressed to Emma Marsden, but actually following that, Emma James mentioned the same thing, and so I'm going to ask all three of you perhaps to comment. But the question was, what were you classifying as questionable research practices? As having such a high percentage seems to suggest you are capturing quite a large plethora of practices. And also, was the sample isolated to York? So I think, Emma Marsden, perhaps if you could start off, but then it'd be good to hear from all three of you on that topic.
Okay. Well, first of all, I wasn't involved in the project. This is secondhand reporting from my colleagues' research. It was a survey done, an international survey that was done across 364 researchers, and 74% of them had a PhD, 86% had published in a journal, and that's to give you an idea of the sample. And yes, it was a very wide range, and as Emma James noted as well, the definition of questionable research practices is very broad and it catches a lot of us out. I would have been in that 86% because I have not tried to publish a study that I found the findings too difficult to interpret, and they were messy, and so I would find myself in that 86%. So to give you a very brief sample of some of the findings, so 40% of the respondents said that they'd chosen the analysis to produce a desired result. 50% said they'd not attempted to publish when findings were not statistically significant. 43% omitted non-significant result from the report. 11% omitted findings contrary to their own previous findings, and 17% said that they'd altered data to change the result or invented data. And I'm very quickly going to add on the end there, I don't even know whether anyone from York replied to that survey. I can't even remember whether I did myself. So no, it wasn't a York specific thing, but they're very widely reported. There's been studies like that in psychology. I hope that's answered the question that was to me, but please, Emma James and Emma Rand, step in.
How about Emma James next?
So the study I mentioned was conducted by Leslie John and colleagues, and it was actually of US psychologists. But again, yes, it's a very broad range of questionable research practices. So the ones that were most commonly admitted to, I've got the paper here, was failing to report all of the measures that they collected. So maybe they collected lots of dependent variables and sort of just left a couple of them out of the papers. Or it used to be quite common for people to collect more data after analysing their results. So they'd see it wasn't quite significant and you'd top up a little bit more until it became significant, and then not kind of use the appropriate statistical controls for doing that. So it is very broad. You know, the rate to admit to, say, falsifying data at the very other end of the spectrum is very low. So yeah, it's a very broad definition.
Emma Rand, and any comments from you from a biology perspective?
I would say I haven't got much to add to that. I would pretty much echo what you two had said. I do think that the QPR, it's rarely cases of dishonesty or open fraud. It's quite often people trying to tell a publishable story with what they've got. And if we can get more recognition for publishing, as Emma was saying earlier, null results or non-significant features or things that disagree with what you might have expected, that would help.
Yeah, and this comes back to the point that I think Emma James was making, and that this is a culture change about how we talk about our science and report our research more broadly. That's probably a good point for us to shift slightly, and we're effectively turning the floor now over to the attendees. And what we're asking you here is for any comments that you might have, any thoughts that you might have about what we should do in York next. So we had a question, in fact, to Rachel earlier on about what we should do in the area of open access. But you've heard three really nice examples from our lightning speakers in particular about things that are going on in their fields, in their disciplines, or in their departments. And this is what will stimulate the real change, the real culture change. So be good to hear either just comments about what you think about what you've heard, or about what you think York could try to stimulate. And in order to do that, what we'd like you to do is two things. First of all, is to use, I believe you can put your hand up on the participants, using the participants button at the bottom of your screens, and I will see your hand raised, which allows me to unmute you so you can talk. So that's, we'd really like you to do that. So stick your hands up, please. But in addition, Ben has opened up a Slack channel. I think you're going to put the link in the chat, Ben, so that you can write things in there. This is thoughts for, yes, it's just popped up. And this is not just for now, this is, we'll keep this open so that you can put in your comments, because we've only got 5 or 10 minutes now. Your thoughts, perhaps your more reflective thoughts when you've had more time to think about things. But who would like to make any comments now? I think I've got to scroll up and down on this to see any, and I'm not seeing any hands up yet. So I don't know whether you can't manage the technology. Heaven forbid, you must have had enough Zoom practice by now. Or whether no one wants to speak. I'm going to come back to the panelists in a minute if no one wants to put their hand up. Not seeing any hands yet. So since we've only got a few minutes, I'm going to do the slightly mean thing and put this back to all of the speakers. That includes you, Rachel, if you're still there, as to what's the best way to spread the word, as it were, but to try to affect more of this culture change, which Emma James described through the reproducibility project in psychology. So yeah, any thoughts about how we do that? Okay, so I'm gonna who am I gonna go to first? I'm gonna go to Rachel. She's just stuck her hand up.
I'm probably at a disadvantage because obviously I don't really know how things are operating at York. So I'll just go for my first suggestion. I think it's worth thinking about rewards and awards as well. So if you were able to recognise some of these practices and have some initiative, and then I think it would help stimulate people sharing their ideas and ways in which they're working more openly, and pick up and learn from that.
Yeah, so it's a bit of recognition and a bit of reward. So I noticed that Scylla's put in a question which is relevant to this. So I'm going to mention it while we're answering this question, because she says a general question, Ray, incentives. So very simultaneously with you saying that, Rachel, what about promotion and retention criteria to recognise OR practices? So that's a slightly more formal part of the reward. So Emma Marsden, I think you were next. You had your hand up.
Link to Silcha's point, really. I was, in order to get to that stage where we're incentivising this kind of behaviour through promotion, which obviously has to be sensitive to the fact that we can't all do open science practices, closed where necessary. We have to bear that in mind. So it would have to be obviously a nuanced set of procedures and mechanisms. But some ways that departments might consider moving forward here are considering their research expectations documents. I understand each department has, well, we certainly do have a set of research expectations, and we've mentioned open science practices on that, but there isn't as yet any sort of prioritization of those above other kinds of practices. But perhaps that's something to consider, where research could be open. Was it open? If that can be considered when we're reviewing our research activities and planning for our research activities ahead. Something that's challenging for particularly early career researchers is the co-authorship issue. So if we're doing open research, it often involves very large groups of people on multi-site initiatives. And then, it's good for your CV to get lead authorship or final authorship, depending on what discipline you come in from. And I think that's something that, well, one professional association in our field, the American Association of Applied Linguistics, has said that you know, co-authorship has to be recognised really strongly, and that's something that maybe a message can go back to REF. You know, this is thinking about things like REF in terms of recognising co-authorship. And another issue is that open research can take longer, as the two Emmas were talking about. So just the pace of research, again, that goes back to that research expectations document, that if research is being done openly in this slow manner, very careful, making everything very available and carefully documented, it can take longer. Registered reports take longer at the initial stage than at the end stage, and I think that's something that we as departments can take into consideration.
So some very interesting points to note there. Emma, any comment on? No. Okay, Emma. Sorry, Emma Rand. So it's the danger of Zoom. I'm looking at you, but of course you don't. You can't see that. We're approaching the end of our allotted time. I'd just like to comment on a couple of the things that have come up in the questions. There's an observation or a question about how much open research practices are taught in undergraduate and master's courses to increase awareness, which I think is extremely important. What about promotion with primary and secondary schools that University of York does outreach with? Which I think is a very, very important point. Does any of the panel want to make any comment about that, or we'll just take that in? I don't see anybody raising their hand, but I think that's a lot of nodding at that. And Masood has commented on Slack. I'll read out what he said. From my viewpoint, Rachel has mentioned acceleration in cross and interdisciplinary areas and relevant support for it. Emma was mentioning having open conversations and learning from each other. How do we bring these pockets of excellence and open research from psychology, education, biology, and other departments together to share experiences and encourage learning from each other? And I think that's probably effectively the perfect point. We're going to have to end now, but that is the question that I think is for us now. That is effectively starting the conversation on Slack. So I really encourage the University of York colleagues who are on this call, and there's a lot of you on it, to put some thoughts in there about how we do that. And I mean, there's lots of ways that from the Open Research Strategy Group and Operations Group, we're trying to think about how to do this, how to stimulate it with this mixture of top-down carrots and bottom-up culture change. There are lots of ways to feed into that, but that Slack channel is one of them. So please do use it, and it's a good way of putting stuff there because it's there and we can read it and we can refer back to it. So I think I need to bring this event to a close and do that by thanking people, thanking all our panelists, particularly Rachel for coming in from UKRI. And just to our panelists for a moment, I know that when normally at the end of this, you know, you can hang around and chat and thank everybody. When Ben closes this down, you just all vanish. So please, thank you very much. And I apologize for what will be an abrupt end to the event. But I'd also like to thank not just the Open Research Strategy Group, which has membership from across the university, but there's an operations group, and there are, you know, 3 people who have really made this event happen, and they are Masood Kokar, Sarah Thompson, not me, Sarah Thompson in the library, and Ben Catt, who has really organised this this event. So thank you very much for that organisation, and thank you to all for joining in. And I hope this will be the start of many conversations that we have as we build our community of practice. So thank you, everybody. And I look forward to reading everything that you write and your engagement in the future. So thank you.